Hi, welcome. Hey, all the people I love are here. Cute. I'm Martha Frankel, boss of Bookfest, as I like to think of myself. Anyway, so it was so nice to see everyone. Could you guys buy some of the tickets for the Dylan thing so I don't have to keep shilling for it? At $10 a piece, cash would be better. Elizabeth Ann has the thing. Then I'll stop. Because we're going to draw it tomorrow and I don't want to not have sold it. And please turn off your phones or just don't look at them. It's very annoying to the people on stage. And what else? I think that's it. I'm just going to start. Last summer, I picked up this book at the Golden Notebook, Griffin Dunne's book, Friday Afternoon Club, and I knew Griffin's dad back in the 90s. He was a writer about crime and murder, and this is how I met him. I went to LA to do a story on a woman. I wrote about plastic surgery, and I went and I stayed at the Beverly Hills Hotel. And I was there for about a week, and when I was leaving, another magazine called. I was out there for Details magazine, and a magazine called New York Woman said, "Oh, you're coming in Tuesday? Go interview Dominick Dunne on Wednesday." And I was like, "Oh my God, that's so cool." So I went to his house, and he had like a lot of stuff that I was really interested in, and he let me just sort of touch everything and talk to him about it. And anyway, he said that he had just come back from LA, and I said, "Oh, I did too." And he said, what were you doing? I said, "I did a story about plastic surgery." And then we chatted, and then he said, I interviewed a woman who used to be married to Gig Young. And he said, "I interviewed Elaine Young." And I said, "Oh, about plastic surgery?" He said, "No, about real estate." Turned out we had interviewed her on the same day. She had breakfast with me, because I said, "Was she wearing that strawberry sundress?" He said, "Yes." She had breakfast with me at the coffee shop at the Beverly Hills Hotel, and then she had lunch with Dominick at the Polo Lounge at the Beverly Hills Hotel. So we thought that was really funny. And then I said, "Boy, I had the most incredible room at the Beverly Hills Hotel." And he said, "Wait a minute. I usually stay in room 100. And I said, "Oh my God." This room was not much bigger than this stage, but it had an outdoor terrace that was as big as that. And so I thought it was so cool, so I did all my interviews in my robe, in my Beverly Hills robe, at one of the tables. And he was so pissed at me that I had been in his room. Anyway, we sort of stayed in touch, and I was out at the Beverly Hills Hotel when he was covering the OJ trial, and he said, "Come downtown with me, come to the trial." And he said, "You should buy all the people were like hawking stuff in the street, like OJ watches. And they was incredibly tacky and weird. They had the Bronco and a knife chasing it. And he said, "You should buy them." And like, I was so in love with Nick, I was like, "All right, I'm gonna buy them." And I bought 4 of them. And when I started the Bookfest, I auctioned them off, and that was the seed money for the Bookfest. So, such a crazy story. Anyway, I read this book last summer.
I also find it amazing that there was a time when magazines sent writers to the Beverly Hills Hotel.
And paid us a fortune. It was very nice. I did a story called The Brat's Guide to LA Hotels, and so every hotel would fight to get me. It was bad. It was bad. But anyway, I read this book last summer, and it just bowled me over. It was about a time that I remember very well, but it was also about a life that's so different from the life I led. You know, it seems like Griffin grew up in a really rarefied era, but yet it wasn't. And there are lines in this book. So we have a mutual friend, Elizabeth, I don't even know how to say her name. I call her Lizzie Bracco. What's her name?
Bracco?
Elizabeth
Quinn.
Bracco. Quinn. Elizabeth Quinn. I wrote her a check once to Lizzie Bracco, and she sent it back and said, "The bank doesn't have your joie de vivre. It's Elizabeth Quinn." Anyway, I would like send Lizzie lines from this book. It's hysterical. And then I said to Lizzie, "I wish Griffin would come here," and she sent him that note, and he said yes. So anyway, I've read the book twice, I've listened to it twice. It's an amazing, amazing story. I could listen to it and read it forever. So I think, I want to know, like, why finally did you write it? Like, what happened? Why now?
Well,
No, excuse, stop. I should introduce
Get
him.
around it.
In case, Griffith's.
It's gonna be like that, huh?
Griffin's an incredible actor, writer, producer, director. He's been in American Werewolf in Paris.
London.
In London. Esther just said she was going to Paris on my head. In London, he was in London too. He was in After Hours. He directed Practical Magic. He directed an amazing, amazing documentary about his aunt, Joan Didion. And really, it was amazing. And then he wrote this book. It's just, so that's, go ahead.
So I have, I'm from a long line of storytellers, and so I'd grown up hearing some just hilarious, crazy stories about my family, and my mother's side of having a great grandmother who became a widow for a day. When her husband died, she married her lover and brought her lover to the funeral. You don't forget these stories. And so I've been sort of collecting them and telling them and stuff that, crazy incidents that have happened to me. And I just kept a file, like, oh, that story went over. I'm gonna write a book someday. And then when I did a doc about Joan that we just mentioned, a structure came to mind, and I started to seriously think about the book. And then when Joan passed on, I started to really look at the notes and take it carefully. And I always had an agent. He wasn't my agent, but he was a book agent. And he kept saying, when are you gonna write your book? He'd heard all my stories. When are you gonna write your book? And I would just nod. And then one day I gave him like 75 pages. And he flipped out and we sold it. And once it was real, I just could not stop writing this book. I did it in less than 2 years. I was shooting a television series, This Is Us, during the time.
Oh, I forgot This Is Us. I forgot that.
And I thought I mentioned that. But I'd be shooting and, they call cut to turn around the camera. I'd just go right back to my dressing room and pick up in the middle of the sentence. And so it was real. So I wanted to get it down just because I was the last one that had these stories, that had this family history, and the only one capable of putting it all, inside of a book. And but I think I was so compulsive about it because everyone except for my brother has since died, and it was like being in their company all that time.
Yeah.
And I couldn't wait to get back.
Yeah. That's the great thing about writing memoirs, that you get to visit with your family again.
Yeah, you really do, and they became so vivid, so real. And the hardest part was finishing it, because then you kind of mourn all over again.
Oh, there's another book in you. I know it. I mean, it sort of ended like we're ready for more. So tell them a little bit about your father's family and Lenny's family and how different they were from each other.
Yeah. Well, my father is a Irish Catholic in West Hartford, and one of 5 children. And he had a father who was a doctor, and he had performed the first open heart surgery, kind of accidentally. There was we didn't plan it, but there was a little boy who was 9 years old, and his father accidentally shot him in a hunting accident. And usually in those days, in the 30s, nobody would touch it. They'd just let the child bleed out, and it was just too risky. But something in him, he was compelled, and he pulled out the bullet, and the boy lived. One of the amazing things about doing this tour is when I was doing a book signing, a woman came up with a binder and she opened it up and there were these old yellow papers from the 30s and said, the little boy your grandfather saved is my father. That kind of stuff just kept happening. And so anyway, I never met the man, Dr. Dunne, I call him. He died before I was born, but I grew up knowing about him because he beat my father, just so abusive. My father was not the most masculine kid. He was, his older brothers, all the other Dunne boys were incredibly good at sports. He could care less about sports. He loved movie stars. And he collected, tore pages out of Betty Davis and Joan Crawford and wrote letters to Tyrone Power. And he would talk about him at the table. And my grandfather would tell him to shut up. And then would take him upstairs and beat him with this Brooks Brothers belt. And it really affected my father's whole life of being with a certain kind of rage that he had and that was just always simmering, that when I was younger until sometime in the late 70s, he was an alcoholic, very serious alcoholic. And it just sort of blew up his life. But he carried that love of movie stars into when he came to California with my mother. My mother was from a daughter of a rancher and in Nogales, Arizona, which is a border town of Mexico. These two people met and fell in love in New York City. My mother was at the Barbizon Hotel and for single ladies, and my father was a stage manager for a live TV show called Howdy Doody.
I went to that show.
And he was the one who would put Howdy on the chair as they were calling for going live, 10, 9, 8, and between 10, the count of 10 and 3, he did filthy things to Howdy, and which cracked the crew up. And then dined 1, and then there would be Howdy like that, having just been defiled. And so my mother liked his sense of humor, and they moved to California, and
Wait, why did they moved to California for a job, right?
Yeah, he moved on from Howdy Doody to Playhouse 90. Oh, I thought I was boring you. One of his things was to go to California to do a live showing for Petrified Forest with Humphrey Bogart. And Bogey was a preppy, like my father. And they kind of bonded over, prep schools and that kind of stuff. And so he went to California to do this live performance and just could not get over it. He went to this party that Bogey invited him to, and he watched Frank Sinatra and Ava Gardner and Judy Garland singing at the piano, and he called my mother. And they just got in this big apartment in New York. And they said, we're going to LA. We're moving to Los Angeles. And they did. And I'd just been born, and they became very big social figures in Hollywood. My father was a television executive, but all of his friends, inexplicably, I still don't understand how this was the case, because movies and TV people did not intersect. They were just the greatest movie stars and directors. Probably now we're in mid-60s. People like Billy Wilder and William Wyler and Gregory Peck and David Niven. They would all be there, but they were old Hollywood. But then, my father, kind of imploded. My mother left him. And he went on a journey of his own. He got sober, and drove up the coast with after selling all of his possessions.
That's really one of the most incredible parts of the book.
Yeah.
This man who had everything winds up with nothing.
With nothing, but you know.
Except the suitcase.
Exactly, but you know, sometimes having everything stripped away, I've never seen such character, such bravery, he found himself. You know, he found out what he was really made of. And he wanted to be a writer. And he would write his children, you know, these typed out single space, 10, 12 pages of just his journey of, you know, what he was going and what he was going through, and the AA meetings that he went to that were, you know, with people he didn't even know, firemen and gas station attendants, and he just had them in stitches, telling them his sober stories and, you know, and his humiliations, and, you know, he found community. So when he came back, he was a very different person. He was a man of character.
Beautiful. So tell us about growing up in LA then, like what it was like for you.
Well, you know, it was my father particularly was, you know, at this period where he's very superficial and very how we were supposed to look and who was famous and a lot of name dropping and a lot of socializing, and so we were kind of like, I wish I knew these people who were in my house as well as I would come to know. I could have talked to so much to Billy Wilder about, but you know, I was 8 and 9 years old or something, and so it was, for me, it was kind of a place I couldn't wait to leave. You know, I didn't really like, I could tell something was wrong. My father kind of made me uncomfortable with the things he talked about, and you know, we had to wear matching, my brother and I had matching bathrobes, and my sister had a little nightgown with one of those little Victorian mop caps, and you know, when they give parties, we'd go down and we'd bow, and my sister would curtsy to the guests, and everybody go, "Ooh, that's so adorable," and it was embarrassing, you know. So I remember years later, I did a movie with Dennis Hopper, and he was there, and we were smoking a joint, and he said, "You know, I was at one of your parents' parties, and you kids came downstairs and you did that bowing thing and curtsy. It was one of the saddest things I ever saw." And that was about right.
I don't know if the picture is in here or it's just in my mind so well of you and Alex in like matching bathing suits. It's so crazy.
Yeah, we had matching bathing suits too. Yeah. So you know, it was always, you know, I first did not want to have anything to do with movies and Hollywood, and then when I eventually got a taste for acting, I wanted to move to New York, and I got myself kicked out of high school and went to New York and started there when I was 18.
Got to go back to Carrie.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about Carrie.
Oh yeah, so yeah, one of the good things about growing up in Hollywood is every now and then you meet somebody kind of amazing, and my best friend from the time she was 15 and I was 16 was Carrie Fisher. And we were just frickin' frack. And you know, we talked to each other in phony Broadway musicals, and she was the funniest person I ever knew in my life. And so when I moved to New York, she moved to New York a couple years after me, and we became roommates. And she became the first person. Well, she said to me once, we were both acting, we were both auditioning. I was a popcorn concessionaire at Radio City Music Hall. She was, you know, auditioning and had been in a musical that her mother was in that was on Broadway. She was in the chorus. And she said one day, you know, I got this movie, and it's going to shoot in England, in London, I'm going to be gone for months. And she said it stars this guy named Mark Hamill and another guy named Harrison Ford, who I'd actually known when he was a carpenter, and he built my aunt and uncle's deck. And I was intensely jealous. And then she would call me from England and wake me up, and she just to complain, just go, "Oh, this movie is such a turkey." God, you should see my hair. I have 2 bagels on the side of it. And we're, chased. We're running down hallways with the big monkey is chasing us. And a little man in a trash can is rolling along. Even the ray guns don't have triggers. Everything is. And then, of course, it was Star Wars. And, we went to the very first screening of the audience seeing it for the first time. And it was at the Ziegfeld in the city. And I've never seen anything like it. It was like if there was a Beatles reunion, it couldn't get any bigger. And people just freaked out. And I knew, that my best friend, that our balance would change. And we were in a building that had a doorman. And, his name was Eddie, and we knew everything about him and who his kids were. We were always joking around. And he was Griffin this and Griffin then. Like, within a week of that movie opening, I come back and he goes, "Good afternoon, Mr. Fisher." What? And, people looked at Carrie differently, they looked at me differently, and suddenly we had our apartment was filled with, these movie stars and rock stars that I admired. But it was like, it wasn't my time for them to know them, So I moved out, and our friendship took a hit for a while, and then we caught up later on. But she was, to this day, I think the funniest, loveliest person I ever knew.
What, Steve and I watched everything that Griffin had ever done, but then we took a detour and watched Wishful Drinking and all of Carrie's stuff. We were like, okay, we got to go back to Griffin, but it's so funny. I mean, reading your take on her and then seeing her take about her mother, it's just hilarious. Talk about John and Joan, your father's brother.
So John Dunne was my father's younger brother, who was not beaten by his father and had a completely different experience, and found him the doctor very loving. So that was the beginning of early tension between these two men. And when John and Joan, when they first were married, and they came to Los Angeles, my father was, at the peak of his social powers and connections. He had John and Joan come and to their house, but then the culture changed and movies changed, and the people that my parents entertained were kind of their best days were behind them, and Easy Rider had come out, and Bonnie and Clyde, and there was a whole new generation of filmmakers and actors, and they gravitated to the parties that my aunt and uncle gave. And then my aunt and uncle became like the hot couple, and as writers, and Joan became very famous from Slouching Towards Bethlehem. And of course my father was, had lost everything, and all of his friends and all of his money, and so there was, years long of animus between these two men, and of which, as I was always caught in the middle because I loved them both, and John and Joan always took me into their world, from a ridiculously young age. They would invite me to their parties, and which drove my father crazy that I was so close with them. But I loved them both, and this went on, oh God, over 40 years. And
those Irish know how to hold a grudge.
they really do. And then one day, you know, my Uncle John had a weak ticker, as he called it, and he'd had a angioplasty and different surgeries, and my father had a very mild heart attack at one point, and so one day my father's going to see his cardiologist toward the very end of John's life, and he goes into the cardiologist's office, and there's John, and they didn't know they had the same cardiologist, and my father goes in, they kind of nod at each other, and my father picks up a magazine and pretends to read it, and he looks up, and John and Dad look at each other, and one of them says, "What the fuck are we doing?" And from that moment on, they were on the phone every day. They were really close, and it was really great to see. I guess John died about a year later. But he always said, "Thank God for that cardiologist visit." You know, it was, but it took that many years.
So I asked Griffin, I wanted Griffin to read a chapter, and I was like, you should read this chapter. No, but he's going to read the chapter about a party at John and Joan's.
Yes.
Chapter 13. Oh, no, what did we say?
Yeah,
13.
no, I think it's 13. Okay. We should have put a bookmarker.
And leave it second candy or something? Because we forget one.
No, hold on one sec.
When do you have a second candy?
What's the second candy? Just a candy. No, I'm totally full.
You know, thank you.
Okay. All right, that's 13. All right. 15, almost there. Here we go.
So set the scene. How old are you?
I am 13, and it's chapter 13. I had grown up around celebrities all my life, but until Slouching Towards Bethlehem came out, I'd never been related to one. The book was way above my head, but my powers of observation were keen enough to know my aunt was famous when I saw a billboard on the Sunset Strip advertising her book. John and Joan lived in a large but crumbling Greek-columned house in an area of Hollywood that Joan once described as a senseless killing neighborhood. The ceilings were high, but the walls peeled paint and the plumbing was moody. Though for $400 a month, there was plenty of room for a literary couple on the rise and their 2-year-old daughter, Quintana. Across the street on Franklin Avenue was a mansion that had once been the Japanese consulate until its residents skipped town after Pearl Harbor, leaving it boarded up and abandoned to a turnover of cult leaders who became John and Joan's neighbors. My parents were no longer married or entertaining, and in a bitter irony that vexed my father, John and Joan became the new it couple, hanging out with the next generation of film people whose work was more relevant to a younger audience. Dad and the old movie stars who once danced to Peter Duchin in his house and drank up his liquor were as baffled as Elvis had been when the Beatles stormed America. John and Joan gave a lot of parties, but their biggest by far was for Tom Wolfe, who was in town promoting Kool-Aid acid test. Joan called my mother to invite her and then added, "Bring Griffin too. Janis Joplin is coming and I know how much he loves her." I was a precocious kid who always made Joan laugh, so it was not unusual for her and Joan to include me in their lunches or dinner parties. They knew that I could handle myself around their crowd of filmmakers and artists who would find my curiosity and familiarity with their work as amusing as a parlor trick. I had been pining for Janis since picking up a copy of Cheap Thrills with the R. Crumb artwork. Her raunchy voice and troubled soul called to me, and I imagined, or fantasized, that when we met, she might find me someone she could confide in. I had a worrisome thought. What if, during the party and in the middle of our flirty banter, Joan found out that I arrived with my mother? On the ride to the party, I worked up the nerve to ask Mom something that had been on my mind since we'd first been invited. She drove her Chevy Nova in a Pucci dress and smelled of fracas, a fragrance that still makes me swoon. Mom, can you not tell anyone that we came together? She thought about it for a moment before asking, you mean pretend we don't know each other? Yeah. So you want people to think you just showed up on your own? Yeah, is that all right? That's fine, honey, but this is a grown-up affair that is sure to go later than I plan to stay. So when I say it's time to leave, I don't want to hear any guff. Well, if I'm talking to Janice, don't yank me out the door in front of her. And for God's sakes, don't say guff. Mom always took me and my narcissism in stride. No, of course not, she said, suppressing her smile. We'll have a signal. When it's time to go, I'll give you a little wink like I'm just some pretty girl at the party trying to get your attention. That's perfect. The party was in full swing when we arrived, and my mother peeled off without giving me a second glance. I explored my surroundings in search of Janice, completely ignored by some guy who said loud enough for all to hear, "What kind of parent would bring a child to this place? It's shameful." I whipped around with a dirty look and saw it was only my Uncle Earl McGrath, madly giggling at his own prank. Earl was a family friend I'd met a year earlier at a party we gave on Christmas Day for people who had nowhere to go. He walked up to me and said, "I'm going to be your fake Uncle Earl, so open your hand." I did as told, and he dropped a half-smoked joint into it. "Merry Christmas," he said, laughing at his own joke, a trait of his I would come to know well. And then, "Don't tell your dad." Earl and John were best friends who constantly feuded, swearing never to speak again and never lasting more than a month before they fell into each other's arms in apologia. I was happy to see him at the party and assumed they'd patched things up from their last quarrel. "Where's John?" I asked, yelling over the speakers blasting Sergeant Pepper. "Oh, look for the most famous person in the room, and there you will find him following me around like a drooling puppy." "Well, I guess you guys are on the outs again." "No, I don't know why I said that," he said, genuinely bewildered by his remark. "We just hugged 5 minutes ago. I love your uncle." "I'm stoned, kid, don't listen to me," he said before he wandered to the bar. The party continued outside where the backyard sloped to a crumbling tennis court last rolled in 1933. I happened upon my father toking on a joint with Harrison Ford, then a carpenter and unknown actor. When our eyes met, he whipped the joint behind his back and we pretended not to see each other. I considered hitting up Earl for some pot, but decided against it because I wanted to keep my head clear for Janice and return to the house to see if she'd arrived. Before I could penetrate the mob dancing inside, I was grabbed by an old, bald man who wore a Nehru jacket and spoke in a thick German accent. "Boy," he said, "sit beside me now." He pulled me onto the chair next to him, holding tightly to my arm. On closer inspection, I recognized him as Colonel Klink from Hogan's Heroes, a popular sitcom about Nazis running a POW camp. Colonel Klink seemed far more intense in person, and it was not at all the wacky Fritz he played on TV. "You must help me," he began, his grip tightening. "I have taken the acid, and I am having a panic. The people here, they are evil, and you are the only one who is a pure light. I need you to stay by my side for the rest of the night." In a heartbeat, I went from being awestruck fan of a television star to figuring out how to ditch him. Someone put on "Get It While You Can," which I took as Janice's entrance, and I tried to stand, but the old Nazi held me in place. "That awful music, pure evil, will this trip never end," he moaned, when his attention fixated on the flames inside a hurricane lamp on the windowsill. I yanked my arm free and made a break for it. Running through a cloud of pot smoke and gyrating adults, I heard him screech, "Stop, young man, come back." He might have added, "Halt or I will have you shot." but I tend to embellish. I went from room to room in search of Janice, but no sighting. Standing by the front door, a woman in a poochy dress, smelling of fracas, pretending not to be my mother, gave me a wink, our signal it was time to leave. I rushed to her in a panic. Oh no, Mom, come on, Janice isn't even here yet. I know, honey, Joan just told me the show at the Palladium doesn't get out till 1 a.m., and that's too late for me and way too late for you. There was no convincing her, and we drove home in silence. The next day, Joan called Mom to rehash the party, and then asked her to put me on. In the middle of my telling her about the actor from Hogan's Heroes, she stopped to say, wait, hold that thought. John, pick up. Whenever something interesting was about to be said, they'd call out for the other to pick up on the extension in their office. Okay, start over, John said once Joan was on. When I told her about Colonel Clank and the bad acid trip, they went into such hysterics, I had to let them catch their breath. Griffin, that wasn't the guy from Hogan's Heroes, John said. That was the director, Otto Preminger. I had no idea who he was, but the trill in Joan's laugh delighted me. They told me that Otto Preminger was a tyrant film director. He came close to burning Gene Seberg to death at the stake while filming St. John. So he could capture the terror in her eyes. I guess I got off easy.
A sitcom about a Nazi concentration camp. America, what a place.
I mean, how about that? That really happened.
Yeah. So, I don't know, should we talk about the second half of the book?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, Nick Dunne goes on to write for Vanity Fair, pulls his life together, becomes a really, really well-known author. His stories in Vanity Fair were the hottest thing in town for years. The first thing he covered was the murder of his daughter, Dominick, Griffin's sister. So tell us about that.
My father had moved from Oregon back to New York. And, you know, before he left for Oregon, my sister was an actress, and she was really starting to take off. And she was helping him out financially. And one of the, my father held a garage sale of all of his belongings. And my sister came and she brought her best friend helped him tag the endirons and the rugs and the different things that he was selling to the very people he were once his friends. And she did the haggling for him, and they were very, very close. My father was closeted, and she saw that her friend, who was older than her but younger than my father, had this incredible connection, and which really delighted her. But she never told us or her brothers. But they had this extraordinary close relationship, all from the moment she was born. Anyway. On Halloween, Halloween Eve, a homicide detective came to my mother's house, who was in California, to say that her daughter had been strangled by her boyfriend, who was really her ex-boyfriend. Dominick is her name, and she kicked him out of the house, and he came back, and he strangled her. And she was on life support. And so my mother called my father. Even though they were divorced, he was the first person she needed to speak to. And then my father told me, and I told my brother, and the three of us flew immediately to Los Angeles. We arrived on Halloween. To this day, I've never worn a Halloween costume. There were all these people dressed up as ghouls, and she was on life support for 5 days. And the guy had been arrested at the scene of the crime, and then we had to take her off. So there was a trial, and none of us had ever had any experience, my father most of all, that we attended every day. That was a year later in Santa Monica, California. And my father, the night before he left for Los Angeles, he was seated next to a woman named Tina Brown, who was just about to start her take over Vanity Fair and reinvent it. And something about him, or something about her, compelled him to just take her into his confidence. And they spoke in very hushed tones at the end of the dinner table that he was going to attend this trial. And he was so terrified, he didn't know anything about the judicial system. He didn't know how my mother had MS too, so he thought he always called his wife, even though they'd been long divorced, that his wife would get worse. And Tina said, if you keep a diary of your experience, I'll publish it. And it kind of gave him some sort of hope or something. And we went to this trial. It was as disastrous an experience as one could have in the judicial system. The judge, for some reason, just hated our family. They would not allow past history of the killer. He had a past history of violence against women. The jury was set out when a woman was giving testimony of her having her eye socket broken and her jaws broken and spending months in a hospital. They missed seeing the killer get out of the seat from behind the defense table and approach her and be wrestled to the ground and see him screaming in rage. The jury never saw that. And they gave him such a light sentence, he only served 3.5 years. So when the verdict happened, we were stunned. And then the judge does his, little wrap up. He goes, well, on behalf of the city of Los Angeles, we want to thank the jury for their service. And on behalf of the Dunne family, we want to thank you. And my father just shot up out of the seat. And he said, don't thank them on our behalf. You have withheld important information. And they said, Mr. Dunne, you'll have your time to speak. It's too late then. And he was escorted and took my mother in a wheelchair, and we left the courtroom. And we were met by a flank of press, and that's when the press found out what happened. And there was, outrage at the verdict. And then Dad wrote this piece, and it's called Justice, and it was for Vanity Fair. It was the very first thing he'd ever had in print before. And it was a portrayal of a family that was going through a system of injustice, but it was also about the portrayal of what a woman goes through, of a victim's right. This was called a crime of passion, as if it was something that took place in France in the 18th century, and it was about honor or something. And it was also, about what they do to a victim of a crime, particularly women, of besmirching her reputation and making her seem as if her life, it really isn't worth that much. We got the full treatment, and Dad wrote about it, and it just blew people's minds, and it destroyed that judge's career. And from that time on, both he and my mother, who was she was in a wheelchair, she far from regressing in her health, she found a purpose, as my father did, and they both became advocates for victims' rights. My father, writing about it, he always wrote about, he let you know who the woman, who Nicole was, who the woman that Phil Spector killed, that she wasn't just some actress. And my mother, who was desperately shy, she would roll out onto talk shows and talk about her experience. And she got a bill passed that was a victims' rights bill that was just started in California, is now in 27 states. Where the legal system, the penal system has to notify families if the killer of their family member is on bail or released from prison. You'd think that would have not needed a bill, but that's what was required. It's called Marcy's Law. That's named after the co-founder. My mother started a group that's still called Justice for Victims of Homicide. So they took this horrific thing and they made it to, they made their experience into something that helped others. And it's helped a lot of people, and they're close with so many families and have been provided support, but also pass laws. That's what my mother most wanted to do. She got great support, we all did, from Parents of Murdered Children, that was started by Sharon Tate, started by Doris Tate, the mother of Sharon Tate, whose life was also mocked in death. But she wanted not just the emotional support, she wanted to provide hope in the legal system and change laws.
Let's take some questions, but then I want to talk about This Is Us. All right. Yeah. In the back. Go ahead. Yeah. Oh, it's you. It's one of my best friends, Ann Hood.
So Griffin, Ann Hood, I met you at the Miami Book Fair with Marianne.
Yes, I can.
Cooper. And I was stalking you because I sent you books to your manager because of your writing about grief in this wonderful memoir. And I wanted to share my story with you. But I wonder if you could talk about what it was like to write about the grief, because I thought you did it so beautifully. You just explained the social part of it, like getting things changed. But I thought in your book you talked about it personally so beautifully.
I just want to say before that, Ann wrote an amazing book. She lost her daughter Gracie when she was 5, and she wrote an incredible memoir called Comfort. It's one of my favorite books. And anyway, she knows about grief.
Yeah. My father's amazing piece, which in Vanity Fair, quite honestly, when it came out, it was for me. It was just too personal. I wasn't. I wasn't ready to have the perspective of how powerful it was for other people. Over the years, it became sort of like a document that I would give people to say, who are going to be in my life. You don't know me until you know this. But that was written from the point of view of a father, and a brother, a sibling's experience is very different in grief, and I didn't expect it to be the second part of the movie, of the book. I didn't expect I'd actually write part 2. I thought it would, but as I was writing chronologically, and I'm having so much fun writing it and all these kind of funny things that happen, I know that the worst thing in my life is coming up. And I see the tunnel, I'm coming up to it. And I think, oh my God, I'm gonna do this. And I realized, that this is the moment where your life is, I'm very different. I was different the day before Halloween Eve in 1982. than I am now. And that's the demarcation. That's where it all changed. And you know, something inside me changed. And when I was writing about it, something inside me changed when I was writing about it. And rather than kind of think, oh gosh, this is so painful, I can't relive these memories, I just went there and I relived every one, and I would write in sort of amazement, like I can't believe this happened, and I'd relive, I would perspire while I was writing with rage at certain times. And then memories of, you know, of Dominick over the years, and I was compelled. I just could not. I had to get it out. I had to get it out. I didn't know editing, know anything. I just moved forward in chronological order. Details would come to me that I hadn't thought of in years and years. And you know, it wasn't all just a tragedy and grief in the feeling and in the writing of it, because we have this Irish sense of humor. My mother's side is Mexican, so we got this Mexican-Irish thing going on. I call it happy drunk, sad drunk. And you know, there'd be moments that were just so absurd. You know, in one of the worst days of our trial, we would have lunch and a memory would come, we'd talk, and we'd cry with laughter. And you know, that our humor sustained us. So I was reliving those moments, and I was just very glad to get it down, and that it resonated with other people. Applause. And you know, one of the odd byproducts of writing this book has been when my father became famous as a writer, particularly writing about on behalf of the victims, and of grief and of loss, so many people would come up and share their story with him. And sometimes now I'm being told almost word for word the same thing by people. And I answer exactly as he did. And it's sort of like what's kept me going and keeping, you know, coming and talking here like this, you know, and it just, the connections this book has had with people that they've shared with me have, you know, been irreplaceable.
I want to look. Well, let's take a couple of questions. I know people have them. Okay.
In anticipation of being here tonight, I rewatched Practical Magic recently, and it holds up beautifully. I really enjoy that movie, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about. Please don't take this the wrong way, but sometimes issues of domestic violence, you know, in a movie made in the 90s don't hold up, and this one really does. And I'm wondering if you could share some thoughts about making that film.
I'm going to repeat the question. She said that she watched Practical Magic, and it has themes about domestic violence, and a lot of old movies do not hold up now with what we know, but this one does. I watched it recently too. It's so good.
That was an aspect to the script that I made much stronger than it was in the script. I knew just what my motives and where it was coming from. You know, the guy who played Jimmy, he was written as sort of a southern sort of, you know, hillbilly kind of shit kicker, and I wanted him to be more dangerous and less sort of stereotypical. And Nicole just understood how terrifying this was. And I shot those to maximum effect. In fact, Warner Brothers had me pull it back, the violence. It was, you know, it was too upsetting for when we were screening it for people, I guess because of the 90s or whatever. But that was that was an important aspect of that. I thought of my family often. You know, I was from a family of very strong women who I learned a lot from, and yeah. So yeah, that was something I'm very proud to, you know, highlight it.
I want to ask about the documentary you made about Joan. What's it called? Everything is, no, what was it called? You tell me.
The center will not hold.
Jesus Christ. I'm in charge here. The center will not hold, of course. So what was that like? I mean, you were so close with her, and there is this feeling of real camaraderie between the two of you. And it's sort of hard to say what's going on, like what the undercurrent is, but what was that like?
Well, it came about, Joan had written what would be her last book called Blue Nights. And the way Your Magical Thinking dealt with John's passing, she did not refer much to Quintana. And so this was an even more painful deep dive, being a mother who's lost a child and dealing, you know, with guilt and look at self-reflection of what she could have done different. When books come out, you know, they oftentimes have a video that they use as promotion. And she asked, in typical Joan fashion, asked the head of Simon & Schuster to ask me if I would shoot the video. And so I said, yes, but I wanted, you're kind of, no offense, but they're always kind of cheesy. I'd really like to do something that's more expensive than you've done. And they agreed. And so Joan and I and a crew, we went all over the botanical gardens and shot different things, and we had a ball. And it was a little 15-minute sort of segment. And I realized there has to be a feature, and there's no one else who she would allow. And I said, a little nervously, I said, listen, I'd really like to make a feature. I'd like to keep doing this. Would you let me do that? And she went, okay. And I was off and running. And it was, even though we were talking about really sad things and going to St. John, where both her husband and daughter and mother are interned, we had a really fun time making it. She loved, you know, getting in the crew van, and the crew just could not believe they were eating chicken salad sandwiches with Joan Didion and their lunch breaks. And so it was a very, it was very difficult. The advantage was that I knew her so well that she'd be so relaxed, and I don't think there were many interviews before then where you really see her roar with laughter, or not roar, she would, whatever sound that was, it was a trill. And, but they never seen also how funny she is, and the way I knew her growing up. So that was the advantage of knowing her so well and being her relative. A disadvantage was having to talk about Quintana. That was in the book, and Quintana had very serious, was a very serious alcoholic. She was adopted, and she inherited from her birth family this raging DNA that she was incapable to get under control. So it was very difficult to talk about that. But I think one of the highest points of my life was it was accepted in the New York Film Festival, and it went to shown at Alice Tully Hall. And at the end of the movie, the tradition is the filmmaker and the actors sit up high up in a balcony, and when the movie's over, they get hit with the spotlight and people cheer, or not. And the spotlight hit us, and while Joan's in a wheelchair at this point, and the railing is very, very low, and it's very far down. And so I thought, when this moment happens, I'm not going to lift her up, I just am too nervous. And this is what I spent all my time thinking about it, like, if I lift her up too soon and she tumbles, and I'm like, this is what's consuming me and the spotlight hits, and the entire audience just gets up and they cheer. I've never heard cheering like that. And I look at Joan, and she looks at me and she goes, "Get me up." And so I gently lift her up.
Whoa.
And it was apparently the longest standing ovation the New York Film Festival had ever had. And I thought, writers don't get to see standing ovations. They don't get to see, 1,000 people, whatever the capacity is, cheer for their life and their accomplishment, and as thanks for all the work they've done. So it was really gratifying that I was able to give her that.
Did that make you think? Yeah. Did that make you think that this book was more possible than you thought before?
Yeah, yes, it did. And that's where I was, talking about Joan, talking about Joan's history kind of inspired me to really lean into my family history. She's so Californian, she's so Western, of the Western Plains. That's why she's so tough. She's her family, the descendants of survivors of the Donner Pass. In typical, what would be Didion fashion, she went, while the Donner Pass chose the shortcut, her family said, "No, we're going the long way." And they went contrary, and it's what saved. So that's where I was thinking, I'm not just I'm gonna do a family history and really research, where I'm from.
Yeah, did you have to do a lot of research? I mean, people have said to me, how could he remember that? I said, he comes from a family that told stories every day.
Yeah.
I understand that. I came from that kind of family too.
Yeah, luckily there's a woman, my cousin named Sigrid, who's quite elderly. I was very aware of this to get her then. As soon as I got this deal, I went to Nogales and I taped her, and she was the keeper of everything on the Griffin. My grandmother's maiden name was Sandoval, from Mexico City, and so I got the whole history on that side.
Yeah.
Quickly, why is it called The Center Will Not Hold?
Why was the doc called that?
Yeah. Yates.
It's from the Yates, when she wrote Slouching Towards Bethlehem. Slouching Towards Bethlehem is a line from the Yates poem.
We have a Yates scholar in the first row, so she may recite it.
Yeah. And it seemed very apt for, what Joan would be writing about, particularly in Slouching, was during the 60s and the so-called hippie movement, she was looking at the infrastructure of family being torn apart, by drugs and runaways, and that's what she saw when she went to San Francisco. She didn't see the peace, love. She saw these kids, these lost kids, and the center, and then she wrote about Manson, and she wrote about the Panthers, and she looked at her own psyche, and she just thought, in terms of the country, the center will not hold.
And right she was.
Yeah. Here we
Slouching
are.
was the first book I ever read that I thought, I could be a writer. This is something.
Yeah.
It was really the first time I ever felt that. So I have to talk about This Is Us, because I forgot that in the introduction, but I remember I was a big fan. And I remember when you first showed up, you were the first character that they did with, it was a different young man, an older man. It was Nicky. And I remember the first time we saw you, Uncle Nicky, I was like, wait a minute, is that Griffin Dunne? I just was so shocked by it. And then we sort of didn't understand you almost till the last episode, right? Like we did not know what was going on. Who you, was he sleeping with his brother's wife? Like what the hell was going on? That's what I was thinking. And I'm not, surely not alone. But the last episode when we realized what had been going on all along that we had missed because we didn't have the clue, it just made me want to go back. And so when Steve and I were doing the research on you, I said, well, you have to watch This Is Us. And I thought we would like watch all 7 seasons together. And he was like, what? Did not understand. But we watched all of your episodes and they're terrific. I mean, what was that like? It's so, TV is so different than movies.
Yeah, although now that everything's streamed, it's kind of hard to tell.
I know, but that's, you know, people watch you in their pajamas.
Yeah. And it was, it was a part that sort of just came out of the blue, you know, that I'd be playing a Vietnam veteran, you know, with PTSD and struggles with alcohol, and he'd be in his 70s, and I'm going, oh, he sounds great, but really what I'm thinking is, I'm only 65. I hope I wear a lot of makeup. I turned out not to wear much makeup at all. But you know what occurred to me, not until I was answered a question during a Q&A, somebody said, you know, did the writers know that your father's name was Nick, as in Dominick, which is what he was called, and that he was an alcoholic who was suicidal, who was also a war veteran? I didn't even make the connection, Phil. I never thought of that. And so I called the guy, Dan Fogelman, who created the show. I said, is that why I got the part? Is that, did you think of that? That's amazing, that's brilliant. He went, it never occurred to me. So it was just one of those coincidences.
I mean, people love that show. My friend Ann Hood is here with her husband, Michael Ruhlman. They sort of met in Miami at the book fair. Not really, but that's the story we like to tell. Anyway, she wrote an anthology. She edited an anthology about the Gilmore Girls. And it turns out that that's like a wildly, you know, people are nuts about that show. But I think people also felt nuts about This Is Us. They had like real stake in that show, right? So I'm so thrilled. I forgot about it for a minute. Somebody have their hand up, Susan?
Bright Lights, Big City.
No.
Just, I mean, I'll never forget that movie for some reason. After reading
Bright Lights to talk about Carrie and Debbie? Yeah.
And, yeah, I mean, wow. I'm amazed by the fact that you were able to write about all these things with your family. I can't wait to read it.
Yeah, hopefully.
Yeah,
What's the question?
the question is, Susan, phrase the question.
Well, I think I'm wrong.
I did too. Okay, we're gonna skip that. Jackie, go ahead.
One of the things that I love so much about the book was the relationships between all the men in the book. You and your dad, and your brother, and your dad, his dad, and it's, you don't see that too much. You know, I think in Memoir, you know, and seeing all those sort of masculine relationships and the depths and the kind. So I want to appreciate that. My question is that actually, what if any inspired you in, or was a model to you when you were writing your memoir? What memoirs did you like? You know, what inspired you when you were thinking?
You all heard the question?
What memoirs inspired me? I can tell you exactly. William Buckley's, Christopher Buckley wrote a beautiful book about his father. Al Styron wrote about her father, William Styron. And I love Philip Roth's book that he wrote about his father. That seemed to be, I didn't set out to write a, you know, father-son. That sort of just came out naturally as I was writing it. You know, and thinking about who I am. You know, something in Philip Roth's book, actually in all three, well, in Christopher and Philip Roth's book, they write about the impact of a father dying on a man, how life transforming that is, more than losing a mother, not to equate, you know, one grief for another, but when you lose a father, it sort of informs you of the kind of man you've been and the one you're going to be. And so I thought about that. I thought about that a lot. And I was writing about, when I was writing about my father, I just saw the little boy. And then, you know, when he was going through his terribly superficial, self-destructive period, and name dropping and trying to make himself puff up and feel so important, I realized that he kept secret till very late in life that this man who'd been called a sissy and was closeted, had in fact was a war hero and never told his children that he won the Bronze Star and he saved someone's life. He went behind enemy lines and carried someone on his back all night long. That was like when it's really important, when it's, you know, something significant. That's not what you brag about. That's like, that was in him. And if he saw Private Ryan, Saving Private Ryan, and that's how I found out. He called me and said, get over here. And he told me about that night in the Ardennes forest, and he took out the Bronze Star. You know, it was an incredible, you know, yet another thing I sort of, you know, learned about him, that, you know, just, it just spoke to his character, the kind of person that he had become, the person he was supposed to become.
Yeah, there's a lot of secrets in the Dunne family, but I think that's what makes a great memoir, is like the unpeeling of those secrets, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You know, people always talk about, when they're telling their family story, and we're going to talk about this a lot tomorrow, about who really gets to tell the story, who does the story belong to. And I think one of the great things about the Friday Afternoon Club is that this is your story, and it's Dominique's story, and it's your father's story, and your mother's, and yet you have the right to tell it all, you know? And your father sort of took that permission for himself by telling the story when maybe you didn't want him to.
He did, but I learned a lot from that. And both my uncle John was a brilliant writer, as well as Joan, and the three of them wrote. While they would write about news stories, they also would write essays that were deeply personal and very revealing. They didn't hold back on their own flaws and fears, and so I took that as, you know, I was inspired by that.
So they just John and Joan's, or is it John and Joan's letters, or is it just Joan's that the public library?
John and Joan's, the Didion family, it's not, they didn't hold anything back. There's like everything there from
At the New York Public Library.
open to the public.
You think we have to make reservations?
I would imagine.
Put that on our list.
Yeah.
We're going to do that.
And it's got, you know, the most intensely personal things to.
Have you seen them? Do you
No.
know what they are?
Well, I do know some of them, yeah. But there's, you know, very, you know, transcriptions of talks with psychiatrists and that Joan took notes of, to receipts for having the stingray fixed. It's, you know, exhausted. They're like 350 boxes or something.
And so how does that work?
No idea.
Okay, I'll let you know. I have to say that until he walked into Oriole 9 tonight, I thought Griffin was punking me. He's just been such a joy and so funny. We've been communicating for about 6 weeks that I thought the real joke was that he wasn't going to show up tonight. And I was just going to be sitting here. But he said he hadn't
I'm
thought
funnier
about
than that.
You are, actually, that's true. We have some more questions? So what's next for you? Oh, we have a new movie it's out.
I have a movie that's out.
Griffin's
Now
doing
it's-
a talk in
Yeah.
Rhinebeck tomorrow.
They're doing a thing, it's called Ex-Husbands. And it's gonna be at Upstate for a screening, and a movie that Darren Aronofsky directed that's gonna be pretty crazy. It's coming out late summer.
A movie that Darren Aronofsky directed, but we don't know the name.
Yeah. And
I don't know if Griffin knows the name, but we don't.
no, it's called Caught Stealing.
Caught stealing?
Caught Stealing.
Oh, caught stealing.
And
Caught stealing.
Caught Stealing. Anyway, that and figuring out what I want to write something more, and I haven't fully committed yet to what it is, but that's the plan.
Well, when this ended, I was like, okay, wait, where's the rest?
Mhm.
It really felt like you need to go back and.
Yeah, I end the movie in my mid-30s.
Not the movie, the book.
Sorry, I keep doing that.
You see it as a movie?
I do see it as a movie, but that's not why I keep doing that. But I ended, with another life-changing moment, and that I didn't intend to end the book at that time, but it was that thing where I was pretty far into it, much higher page count than I edited it down to. And I just knew emotionally that was the end. Since then, since 35 to present, I haven't quite got the perspective for another book yet, but maybe I will.
Okay. When we're done, Griffin's going to come down there and sign books, and you buy your books in the back and buy books because that's why we're here. We started the Bookfest to keep the Golden Notebook afloat, and then many things have happened, change of ownership, and was just thrilled that they're still here, that we're still here, and they're still here. Yeah. So, when Joan died, did you feel like, Jesus, that was like the end of...
Yeah, I did. Yeah, it was certainly the end, the end of that generation, and in my life, and when John died, my father stepped in and John was really like her protector. He just looked after her, and everybody thought they'd be, that he always, she was more famous, that bothered him, and in fact he would so aware of his wife's celebrity that if they were in a restaurant and he saw someone craning to get a look at Joan, he would move his chair so they get a line of sight. But when he died, my father became her protector. And then when my father died, I fell naturally into the role. But she was also, since I knew her from such a very young age, she was like a sort of second mother to me as well. So it was.
I want to say that your father and John didn't speak for decades, but your mother and John were still very close.
Very close, very
Which
close.
is sweet.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, what do you think?
Let's sign books.
Let's sign books.